Hello, welcome back to the Doomer Optimism podcast, where we have rotating guests, rotating hosts. And today I have the pleasure of speaking to, he goes by Speaker John Ash. He's been a friend of mine for at least a couple years, 2 or 3 years on Twitter. We've talked to each other multiple times. And he's always been up to something that I've never quite been able to grasp what he's up to, but he's up to something that I think is really interesting. If you look at his YouTube page, and we'll link to that, he has a lot of videos, both talking about social systems and innovation, social systems and technology, as well as creative work as well. He's a musician. He does, visual art stuff, kind of an all-around, would you call yourself an all-around kind of polymath kind of type of person? I don't want to put you on the spot.
I don't. I tried to identify, just buying myself to no specific label or whatever. But I do like to do a lot of things.
Yeah.
And I don't like the feeling of having to rely upon other people to make something happen. I've always been an individual contributor, so I'm always trying to learn as much as I possibly can about how to bring things into the world, and in particular how to communicate better and clearer without having to rely on a video engineer or an audio engineer. If I have a vision that I want to put into the world, I want to be able to do it myself without having to pay or rely upon somebody else.
Nice. Yeah, and you've definitely done that. Well, why don't we start out before? Well, let's start out by having you briefly introduce yourself. You maybe talk a little bit about kind of what your creative and social vision is. Take as long as you need, and then we'll unpack different parts of it.
Yeah. I had a sort of vision starting in 2014 about where I thought the future was going, the future of society, and sort of how all of these different parts like social media were playing out with things like politics and just general belief, right? And I had this sort of expectation about where the state of the information ecology was going at that time. And I was really just, like you said, I'm very interested in learning and learning all types of things. So for whatever reason, in 2014, I just became really fascinated with wisdom of the crowd and collective intelligence and collective decision making. It wasn't necessarily that I was in that moment trying to create a new system at all. It was rather that I was just exploring that which interested me the most. And I was working at a company that did financial technology, and I was doing machine learning for them to understand essentially the meaning behind transactions, like regular bank transactions that have some sort of text string associated with them. Because the company that I was working for, we were sort of like Mint. It was an aggregation of all of your different accounts that represented, your financial standing. And because there's so many different sources of information, there's not a lot of consistency between how that was being represented, right? The different transaction strings from different banks were very, very different and had a very different sort of grammar to them, even though there was no established real grammar. It was just sort of something that was emergent from the nature of that particular financial institution. So I was doing a lot of work at that time with machine learning, trying to understand what those strings in the transactions actually meant, to try to create sort of a picture of what their spending actually was and what it represented as them as a being, like a very rich resolution version of that. And as I was doing that, I couldn't help notice that the connection between the transaction as being this thing that represented a piece of exchange, and something like a Twitter post, which was representing and could represent a specific belief, right? So I had this sudden insight, I think in 2014, which was just this very basic thing of, I feel like I predict the future pretty well, better than other people. And I would have like visions of like companies or products that I thought were going to come into existence. I wasn't necessarily interested in following up those ideas, but I felt confident they were going to come into being. And often I noticed that the ideas that I would suggest, to people around me, other engineers, it's like, maybe sometimes I'd want to do them. Or like, maybe we should do this because I think it's going to be a big thing. And they would say like, I don't think that's going to be a big product. I don't think that's going to happen. And then, years later, it would turn out that some company pursued that idea relentlessly, implemented it well, and had like a market cap of hundreds of millions of dollars. So I had this realization that there was a lot of signal being lost in the form of predictions when people weren't exactly willing to fully commit to something or make a bet or something like that. And I was realizing that, of course, you can measure it. Of course, you can establish which voices are most aligned with the future, but how do you do that, and how do you do that fairly? And so it was just like I went through a couple of years of just learning everything that I possibly could from, information theory and wisdom of the crowd to the Good Judgment Project, which uses Breyer scores to establish how good people are at predicting the future, to prediction markets. And some point in 2016, a lot of my predictions about where the information ecology was going and the amount of misinformation that we were going to start to see started to become validated in that sort of post-truth era. That I was having these sort of vague ideas that we were leaving a sort of information age and entering into a bubbled misinformation age, that there was going to be these tiny little pockets of voices that were, echo chambers, and that the algorithms were not causing individual people to view views that were disparate from their own. And so the only time that really, they would be exposed to something would be something very, very different, not like just something like subtly different, because they would be in this little bubble of miscommunication. And because of that, and because my life was just changing at the time, and the company that I was working for, I just didn't feel like it was like long-term a moral path to go down. And because I wasn't really seeing anybody talk about any of the ideas, like I wasn't aware of Tristan Harris releasing some document at Google saying these distribution algorithms are causing, real harm to the way that we think and integrate with each other. I wasn't aware of the term sense making. I wasn't aware of any of this. All I knew was that I saw a problem. I had a prediction about where it was going. And I felt like the types of information that I had exposed myself to and the ideas that had come as a result of it were just ahead of the curve, and therefore I needed to get them out into the world. So I sat down and I called up some friends, and the best way that I could do it at that point was just put it down to word, create this manifesto, because I wasn't interested in forming a company for a large number of reasons. And I wasn't interested in pursuing it, specifically building it myself, for a large number of reasons, particularly related to prediction about how I thought it would go if I tried to build it at that particular moment. And I wrote this manifesto, and I got to this certain point where it just felt that it was like a sort of linear representation of a systems level thinking, because you read top to bottom. And I was starting to become more aware that no matter how precisely I wrote that first paragraph or the first line, it's not going to make the same sense to every single person that was reading it. And so I wanted to shift how I was approaching bringing the ideas to the world. And I was also thinking very realistically about, like, if there was some sort of new system to emerge, if we were to have some sort of real systems change away from this system that's been in place for, hundreds of years at this point, how would that actually look? And I did not see that happening within this financial landscape, because to reach people, you essentially need an ad campaign. That means you essentially need money, or you need to be able to convince artists to work for you. And so I was seeing, like, well, anybody who tries to create an organization who's trying to change the world, they're all playing that same game. And that same game is the game of attention, as quantified by money, and the capacity to allocate money to advertising, and the capacity to convince artists essentially to be able to create art in the name of propaganda, or what we call advertisement in the financial system. And so I felt that the only way that we'd have real systems change is if there was some sort of independent artistic movement of people creating art and music and just putting into the world a convincing argument in all different media about why we should change. And I didn't really feel like anybody could get behind anybody who was putting such a claim as I was about new systems without them actually being part of that, without them actually committing to creating content. And then the other half of it was that, wow, this is a really big task. I want to use the totality of my brain, the totality of myself to be able to achieve this. And I had spent so long in this tech sector, but I had also spent, many years of my life just really fascinated with songwriting and in love with the process of making music. And so I wanted an integrated sense of self. I wanted to merge the creator part of me, the person who's making art, who's communicating, with this tech vision, to ground it, right? And to not just be this sort of game B bro who's just like, bro, we gotta fix this, and this is the only possible way. But rather, I wanted to be a person who was communicating well about the state of the world and communicating well about what I expected to see in the future, such that I imagined more and more voices would start to emerge independently on their own because they're exposed to the same information. And then all these voices would, in a decentralized way, sort of start moving towards some sort of basin of attraction, right? Some central thing would emerge that would, in a decentralized way, organize all of these different voices. And so that is what I did. And now when I look around in the last year, there are increasing numbers of voices who are saying a very, very similar thing, especially after Facebook renamed themselves to Meta. Now there's this incredible fervor in all of these Web3 communities to try to say, okay, this vision that I have of the future, this new system, this is the right way, and we need to get behind this or whatever. But for years, there really was nothing that I could find. Either the algorithms were not connecting me to the right content, or it did not exist, or, time is not fixed in the past, but I'm not gonna jump on that one because that's a scary realization. Nothing is real. This moment is all generated, and past and future are imaginary. So that's my setup. Sorry if that was a bit long and rambling.
Yeah, well, that gives me a lot to work with. Well, let's start with how you. I'm curious because so this is the Doomer Optimism podcast. We also talk about systems change, and we tend to emphasize a lot about kind of getting grounded, right?
Yeah.
Becoming more resilient, localizing communities.
Yeah.
There's a lot of emphasis on like agroecology, regenerative agriculture. There's a lot of expectation that the current system, and system is a big word, financial system, material flows, energy availability, none of that is very, very much a sure thing. And so we need to start thinking about, if we don't believe that the current system is sustainable for whatever reason, some people take a more political slant on it, some more an ecological climate slant on it. Others, energy availability, resource flow, but for whatever reason, we don't see the current system, set of systems maintaining themselves. How do we prepare for what's next? And so I'm curious, with you and your systems change, you seem to have focused a lot on kind of like the digital sphere and kind of coordination, kind of incentive compatibility. How do you see kind of your framework interfacing with Doomer optimism, and kind of what we tend to focus on? And do you see them as kind of like, kind of compatible and complementary, or do you see them as just kind of different views of reality or different reality tunnels?
They're very compatible. I think that in addition to my ideas about how we share and put our beliefs to record and hold accountable to people to their actions and things they've said in the past, depending on outcome, I also have just this whole level of my own beliefs that I would like to see tested in some sort of sense-making network. And a lot of that is this sort of simple reality that the people who are going to fix a local area that is somehow dilapidated are going to be the people who live there, right? Like, who else is going to do it? Is the sort of future solution that somebody from somewhere else is going to come and like magically fix the localities, or is it that the people who are living in certain places and have a cultural attachment and connection to certain places, we're going to be the ones who are going to take the action to improve, right? And so I personally have this grounding and belief in a localist approach, but I also think that a lot of people have very, very different perceptions about what the best choices are to take, what the best future looks like, and how to get there. I think we live in a time that is dominated actually by prediction of at a global scale. That the big one is the climate change, right? That we have hanging over our head this idea that there is this likely future. There is that, oh my God, bird just flew into the window.
Birds could talk about climate change too.
There's this perception of this likely future that a lot of people don't want to see happen. And we have this general belief as humans that we can take actions to change the future. And the problem is that the scale of the actions that we need to take are much larger than any one individual. When you break it down, it is simply individual people taking action, right, towards making a better future. But that is extraordinarily complex, and a lot of people have or are doing poor sense making. Their understanding of the world around them has some misalignment, but they feel very certain, very confident about the actions that they should take. So I am just simply looking around at all of these different beliefs and these different ideas about what we should do, right? For example, like I think that one of your beliefs is that people should grow food like themselves, that they should take the time to learn to grow food. And there is something very integrative and grounding about that. And that is something that I also would agree with. But I am not certain about any specific thing. I sort of view the world through the lens of a spectrum of certainty. And I'm always willing and ready to update my beliefs if new evidence arises, right? So it is hard for me to imagine edge cases or to certain claims like that, doing physical work a little bit per day is good for your well-being, right? It's hard for me to imagine concise claims or circumstances that would be contrary to that, but there might be, right? And so what I want is that if my sense making is off, if my perception of the world is off, then I would say that in the future, if that is revealed, that my voice should be amplified less than other voices. Like at any one particular moment, there is a distribution of collective attention right now, and that is mediated by algorithms, right? The algorithms are delivering content to many different people's minds. For all that you're doing in your localist world, you're still on Twitter quite a bit, and that is your, and there's probably more, but that is one of your connections to the world at large. And that is sort of like the second brain, which is taking in your thoughts, it's placing them in some sort of graph representation, and it's learning some, representation of the meaning of what you're actually putting out there. And it can very rapidly and very quickly distribute your thoughts to the voices that it would be relevant to, right? So we already have systems that you're constantly interacting with on top of your general grounded view and your general like local view of, this is the land that I'm working on, this is the land that I'm stewarding. And how do I say this? Like you're trying to create sort of an integrated sense of community within your own family in that space. And that's a healthy and good thing. But there still is this layer where you're connecting through technology, and it's mostly invisible. Like you don't really have much say about how the algorithm works or what the algorithm is doing, but it's doing a pretty good job. I think that there should be a process by which the way that that is functioning is made explicit, and we can directly interact with the algorithm, and we can be a lot clearer about what it is that we are trying to say if we are trying to say it. Like we share a lot of different tweets. It is hard for to know which one is more valid or important than the other, because all you have is a binary signal of a heart. So how does it distinguish between like a shit post and like you saying like, this is really important, this should be attended to, and it should be attended to in the future, and I'm really confident about this, so I would like to be in attention to it. Like for example, like I would say that your claims maybe about soil health, you have more passion or connected more to it than your claims about like the Three Sisters planting system. That was just a small little thing that didn't have a lot of weight or bearing. But there should be a means for all of these different doomer optimists who are basically saying, this is what I think the future is going. These are the actions that I think that we should take to steer the car in a different direction. And in the future, I'm willing to be held accountable to these claims because I want to be part of that sense-making network, and I want my voice in the future to be amplified more based off of these claims that I'm making. So that, and the motivation is because, you want to see the world become a better place, a better future, or whatever a better future means to your individual mind. So I think that it connects, very, very directly. The idea of a doomer optimist is inherently in relationship to the future, and is inherently in relationship to uncertainty, meaning that there is some sense that there is some doom ahead, but the optimism means that if we take actions, that we can steer away from that unwanted future.
Yeah, no, that's all very interesting. A couple comments, I guess. I mean, one is, I see doomer optimism as kind of an ecology of individuals, many of whom don't really interact with each other or don't like each other, which is fine. Actually, I think it's kind of interesting and better that way. And it's a lot of people. What's interesting, it's a lot of people experimenting, I would say. I mean, there's definitely kind of a localist slant, but there's, people have different ideas about, say, the role of technology, the role of, say, nuclear energy, or whatever. And it'll be interesting, it'll be interesting to see, how it evolves. Now, as far as like interaction with the internet, you're totally right. All of us, Doomer optimism is an online phenomenon, which is kind of the ultimate irony. I think it's an irony that, that isn't acknowledged often enough, by especially the more localist side of Doomer optimism. But I think it's really important and interesting. I mean, the way that I make sense of it, I don't know how others make sense of it, is I kind of see this notion of cosmopolitan localism, where I do think we need to localize our material realities more, enter into closed loop systems that are more at the bioregional and watershed and even village type scales. But I personally also think that, if we can have some kind of decentralized coordination at larger scales, it'll be a much better world than not. If we don't have that, if the affordances of digital technology, aren't available in the future, then I see a much more violent world. For example, I see a lot more warfare than, perhaps if we're able to govern at larger scales when necessary, and make decisions, foster collective intelligence at a larger scale. And so for me, this tension between localization, grounded, grounding our realities with fostering collective intelligence, is a really interesting and important tension. And where I personally, where I see how the work that you're doing, can be really helpful for Doomer optimists, is this work in, how do we communicate with each other in ways that have, in ways that have a high signal to noise ratio, right? Where, people who are putting out good signals, and are, like you're saying, are saying things about the future that actually turn out to be true, their voices are upregulated, perhaps in the future, or whatever, right? So there's some kind of strong coordination ability and mechanism. I don't know. I'm curious how you respond to that. How I kind of see you fitting into this larger, ecology that we're kind of bootstrapping here.
I mean, I agree, it makes sense. And also there was a thought that came to mind, which you said that this sort of irony or of the Doomer optimism thing being on the internet calls to mind something you tweeted recently, which I hadn't really like directly connected to my mind, which is that be careful about how clever you are with your tweets, because the more, likes that it gets, the bigger the carbon footprint it is. And I was thinking about that, like, I don't really understand the full architecture of Twitter and how they distribute those thoughts. But the more attention that each particular thought gets, the more like server time that literally gets spun up to be able to, distribute this. So if we're doing that, it would be nice if the energy expended on distributing those thoughts was mostly spent on signal and not spent on noise. We're constantly in relationship to the algorithm, and we constantly get this incentive feedback signal of people liking or sharing or reacting to our thoughts. And sorry, I had a brain fart. This happens sometimes. No, we're always in relationship to people liking or reacting to our thoughts, and that actually changes our brains, right? That the incentive of the like actually produces new thoughts to come out of our minds. And I would say that, the more clever of us can work within that sort of incentive to have, to still say what we're trying to say, to still try to say the truth, but in a clever way, like in some sort of shit posty way, which is like funny, and therefore it will reach the most people. But I'm not necessarily sure that that is the best way to do it. So I think the ultimate question of our time is just, how is free speech distributed by these algorithms, and why are we allowing these corporations to be the arbiters of speech, or why are we allowing corporations to be the ones who are distributing? Like, this seems to be the most, I mean, our thoughts and our language all in real time spreading across the internet is what is guiding all of collective action. So when we see very unusual, or what we refer to as unusual emergent properties or behaviors in individuals, like, we really shouldn't be surprised, right? So there should be means, I think, and there should be a heavy and hearty discussion that is just coming down to, like, how are our thoughts being distributed and recorded over time, and how are our past thoughts being brought up to make current, to make better present decisions, right? And I don't necessarily think that I see that as being the heart of the conversation in a lot of Doomer Optimists. I think a lot of the heart of the conversation was individual actions that people should take to improve specific things. And that's great at all, but like, that is just going into the same void of this algorithm that behaves a certain way. And if the way that you're phrasing it is not aligning with what the algorithm has learned is useful to distribute to increase time on site, then your thought really isn't going to be distributed. So for all of the individual beliefs that Doomer optimists have about, like, homesteading or specific system change, or whatever it is that they have, it is all being distributed and aggregated by a force that is outside of their control. So I think that, disregarding my specific ideas about what that should look like, the conversation really needs to steer more towards that. And it needs, we don't really have any means to control. Like, YouTube just moved the downvote system, right? And so it's going into this more and more binary way, which is, you're no longer allowed to express degrees of certainty. You don't have the 5-star rating anymore. It's either just like, right? So there is like passion about it, but like, how do you take this idea of distributing free speech in real time, which is a brand new thing that has happened in the last, let's say 20 years, the social media era, and how do you do that does not involve the profit incentive? The first thing that they discovered that makes the business model work is advertisement, right? Which is basically just the manipulation of your attention. And that's what it's all doing, is it is manipulating your attention. But as these algorithms get greater levels of resolution, I have found that you can sort of curate your own algorithm to have positive effects on your long-term well-being. And so hopefully there are a small number of rational individuals that are able to slide through and work through this system that already exists to amplify this idea. What if we didn't have all of this speech distributed by a company for profit? How would you have a collective sense-making network that was still free, right? It shouldn't be something that like is tied to money, but that isn't trying to manipulate your attention, isn't trying to change you. I mean, like at Facebook, there's literally like, they do fucking A/B psychological testings to try to change people's beliefs, just to see if they can, right? They're trying to understand how to shape behavior, and certainly in China as well. So if there can be a sense-making network that is not hierarchical, that is like of the people, by the people, and we come to some agreement about like what is a good protocol for the exchange of our differing perspectives and a way to hold us accountable over time to those different perspectives when they either do or don't pan out, then we start moving in a direction that we can feel is with more certainty or confidence that it will be positive, that our actions are not just being thrown into the nothingness, and that like if I'm not pursuing profit, then I'm wasting my energy, you know?
Yeah. I mean, this is a big issue. I know that, and I'm sure you're much more familiar than me, you know, it seems like a big part of the promise of Web3 is to kind of bring back the promise of Web 1 before the, you know, large corporations kind of took it over and started manipulating it to harvest our attention. You know, as to whether that'll be successful or not, we'll see. I know that, you know, there's, you know, a lot of people meet on, say, a platform like Twitter, and then they move to other platforms. Some of them, you know, meet each other on Zoom and have their own kind of private chat groups, you know, Discord. You know, there's, you know, new, just, I mean, so there's people who are moving offline, you know, starting podcasts, right? Mm-hmm. Where it's more of a, you know, the people have more direct control over what is kind of delivered to an audience. But you're right that Twitter is still kind of the means of finding people, finding the others. You know, at least from my point of view, just without taking into consideration, you know, the larger business model, it seems to have done a pretty good job for me, right? Like I've met tons of people over the last few years, including you, that, you know, I've resonated with quite a bit. You know, I've met with off of Twitter, you know, either through video or in person. And we started stuff, right? And we started various collaborations. And so it's largely been positive. You know, I don't really know if, you know, if this is just kind of the tip of the iceberg, and it could have actually been, you know, even much better, right? If you know, the algorithms were more in line with our values. It's hard to say. Yeah, so I guess I'm hearing what you're saying, but at the same time, for me, like, that's not my overriding concern, even though, like, in kind of in a visceral sense, even though in a kind of, you know, intellectual sense, you know, I totally agree with you.
Yeah, the easier path is obviously to just say, I'm just going to handle my own, right? The probable future is some sort of collapse. So like the best actions that you can take are to learn skills to be able to exist in that potential future. That is what a reasonable human being would do. I'm not a reasonable human being. I'm a little bit fucking bonkers in a way. And in fact, when I started down this path, I remember trying to quantify how likely success would be. And it was like 4%. It's 4% that, like, by me going out into the world and putting these ideas and just keeping at it, that I could reach the number of minds that I would need to create, you know, a sizable change in perception about the path that we're on and the way that we're making decisions at scale. As I've gone down this path, that confidence has gone up quite a bit. But like, you know, I mean, I definitely still think like probably what I should be doing is what you're doing, right? Like probably I should be just getting land and just like learning to be able to exist in the most likely future. But there's some irrational thing in me that says, don't do that, right? Don't give up yet. You have, for whatever reason, you're presented with all of these ideas. The best work that you can particularly do is just try to communicate with them. And I've heard the same thing that you say from other people, which is like, that makes sense, but I'm not going to put any effort towards it. Which is what Jim Rutt said as well. He said that I could see that makes sense, but I'm not going to try to do that or create that world. And, part of that is just because, well, we have selves, we have to exist in our own timeline, and we have to there is accountability in the real world. It's just at a much smaller scale. So you're accountable to your friends, you're accountable to your family, you're accountable to just your own life and your ability to be able to provide for yourself and the ability to keep yourself healthy. At that basic level, there's this accountability built in to the choices that you have to make every day. That is the logical, reasonable choice. But there are some people out there who I think actually thrive. They just thrive in this type of thinking, and they love to just build things. I'm one of those people, and I got pretty close in actually building out the system before I froze it for a number of reasons, and said, well, if I put this out into the world, it's not going to go the way that I expect it to. Yeah. Because people don't have the context or understanding to be able to understand what I'm saying. Like I had this interaction this morning, for example, with people about vaccine mandates. And all I was trying to get them to do was to put some sort of prediction or concise claim on record with some degree of confidence, right? So that we could back reference it and say, okay, this is your expectation. You have a lot of fear right now. They're operating from a place of fear that there is going to be control, right? Authoritarian control. And that there's a lot of fear right now that all of these actions and choices are being made specifically and only because the government has some big plan that is trying to enforce control over people. And that's a very, very interesting claim. It may be true. It may be that in the future that we are in a place that we have a lot less autonomy, right? And so that's why I've been from the get-go that, well, if this is the way that it's trending, and if you really think that this is the future that we're going to go in, right? The assumption that you will have the freedom to have some sort of, modern techno feudalism or something like that, where people are just going to leave you the fuck alone on your homestead, like that might be very false, right? The idea that this bubble will still exist where each individual can still just create their own world and have their own accountability to their local community and have accountability to people around them. Well, does that work if there is some very large, powerful, hierarchical organization that can just come in and shit upon you? Like when I talk to the people who are trying to create these new land cooperatives, future thinkers, for example, when I talked to, I think his name is Mike, he was just talking about, like, I'm running into all of this established law, right? I'm running into this behemoth thing that does sense making very, very poorly, very, very slowly, and tries to enshrine these beliefs into these hard set rules that if you break these rules, that the state can use violence against you, right? So I definitely understand the logic of just saying, like, this can make sense, but I'm just gonna go off and focus on my own world. It's not a foregone conclusion that that bubble that you have will be able to exist if you just disconnect from these increasingly authoritarian structures. I don't think that the increase to authoritarianism comes from some central mind or thing. It's just an emergent process in the fact that already has structure, and like power accrues power unto it to himself. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, let me inquire here. I mean, so I definitely don't count myself as a person who just wants to kind of create their own bubble of reality and ignore the rest of the world. I think that's also naive. I do think that we need to pay attention to the outside world. I mean, part of the reason why I advocate for a cosmopolitan localism is we need to be connected. We need to have kind of broad scale solidarity to some degree, and to be able to help each other and figure things out, at some kind of collective level, while also having some kind of autonomy and agency and responsibility in our smaller sphere. And so that tension and balance is really interesting to me. I'm curious about, I want to go into in a little bit some of your specific ideas, but kind of at a more meta level. Before that, you've right from when I met you, you talked about how you had this manifesto, the Cognicist Manifesto, and you're thinking about the probability of you can make a difference by putting it out there and people listening. And I'm wondering how you're thinking about kind of you having the right answer and other people, or the right approach, and other people signing on to it, that model versus kind of a co-evolutionary model where your ideas are consistently changing in bouncing off of other people's ideas, and there's more of an interactive kind of model. I guess one kind of hesitancy when you were first telling me about your manifesto is like, oh boy, another person with a manifesto, right? Where it's like, I've figured it all out, I'm going to put it out into the world, I just need enough people to sign on, versus the model of, hey, I have some ideas, let's engage with these ideas together, and it's constantly changing, and it's not like me coming up with the solution and putting it out there, but it's a ecology of sense making. And I know your manifesto is partly directly focused on improving that ecology of sense making, and so there's kind of an interesting kind of meta dimension there. But
so
you want to riff on that a little bit, and kind of from writing the manifesto till now, has your view and kind of your initial thinking has in relationship to the larger ecology, has that changed, or is that, I don't know, is it evolving, would you say?
I think that the manifesto puts forward this notion that we can't fully ever know anything, that we can approach knowledge in degrees of certainty, and therefore the idea of creating a system for assessing our collective perceptions of truth over time is valuable. When I was writing it, I have these other beliefs. I studied psychology and neurobiology in school, so I have these other ideas about how monetary incentives actually structure the brain and create and cause people to make different choices. We're all like individual agents who are trying to still have to preserve our own personal well-being, right? At the end of the day, nobody can be purely rational good. Like a representative of the US government, like still needs to they're still human. They still need to eat. They still need to take a shit, right? So they are sort of imperfect. And I started from this position that essentially that if I would go and form a group, right, that there would be essentially this problem of communicability even within that subgroup. And there would be an illusion of understanding of the ideas that I was putting forward into the world, because we'd still have to be organizing and collectively making decisions based off of the old methods, which I'm inherently saying don't work, right? I'm saying that the forms of making decisions together that we currently have, because they're all under this overarching profit incentive and all of these incentives around us, that naturally the natural human dynamics of like hierarchy, the natural human dynamics of like how we share knowledge and how we interact over time would just come into play. And I predicted that if I went down that path, that it would essentially, somebody would try to push onto it ideas that were I thought were going to be detrimental or going to have a long-term negative effect. So my perception of being like the validator of what I'm saying is, do I start to see more and more people who are in alignment with what I was saying in the past? And I am seeing that more and more people who are independently coming to these ideas. The thing is, oh God, I had such a beautiful thought. Where did it go? Individual perceptions trying to build out. Damn it. Say that. Can you say the question again? Maybe it'll bring back the thought.
Oh boy, now let's see if I can remember the question. Well, I'm just interested in kind of what your journey has been like with regards to kind of your individual vision versus kind of an ecology of sense making and how those two interact. Like,
yes, it's essentially that the ecology of sense making is happening within the old dynamics, right? Yeah. And therefore that I felt that this particular circumstances which it all came through was very uncorrupted by any outside of incentives. It was just fascination and interest. And so I'm not going out there saying I am absolutely certain about this. I'm saying that I have these beliefs. I am willing to be held accountable to my word and my claims about those beliefs. And that God, what keeps running away from me?
Maybe it'll come back. Maybe it'll come back. Let's well, okay. It seems like one thing you're saying.
No, I mean, I understand the point that you're making is very valid. Like there is this emergent thing that is happening, but I'm also seeing it play. Oh, okay, here we go. I'm also seeing it play out basically through the same order of fucking ideas that I had. Right? Like I was going through a lot of different ideas, trying a lot of different things. And, you know, like for a long time, I was on what the tack that I see a lot of people are now starting to be on, which is what I call schema-ist, which is, okay, we basically enshrine current systems of tallying or decision-making in the form of like ranked choice voting or some new form of democracy or something like that, where it's just like you're adding up points, you're trying to turn collective decision making into numbers that you can add together at a very, very base sense. And so I pursued that for a long time, and I was just like, there's no way you can make a perfect algorithm that is always going to be right, because the way that we make sense of the world is going to change. So there needs to be evolvability of how the system is learning itself what voices are the most accurate. So yeah, it just comes from this prediction that, you know, if I go down this path and I sort of form together with these different perceptions, right, that it won't naturally result in the ideal system being built, that is just going to be like a lot of different preconceptions. Therefore, if I just honestly put it out to the world and watch as other people go through the same thought processes, which I sort of expected to happen because we're all exposed to the same information, you know, now the social dilemma is out. So it's very easy for people to come to that same conclusion. I couldn't fucking explain in 2015 very concisely everything that is said in that movie. I felt all of those things. I had an understanding of all of those things. But if I was to try to have a conversation with another person and explain them, they wouldn't make sense. So the reason why I'm not just going down that iterative collaboration with people is because there was all this simulated iterative collaboration in my own mind, right? Yeah. And it was working through all of these different ideas and being exposed to all of these different approaches. And so when I see earlier ideas that I was playing with before I felt confident enough to write the manifesto play out, and I have these past predictions like, no, that's actually not going to go right? Then I think just like the best thing that I can do is just keep holding back and keep sharing what I think is this representation of truth. And I'm seeing more and more voices independently come to that decision, right? And that's what I think will be the true sort of decentralized reinvention of society, is that it's not going to be me, or it's not going to be an individual person with some hierarchical structure internally working together where one person says this is how you build it, but it's rather that it's a lot of people independently coming to these ideas, and that trying to find a protocol for us to grow together so that these independent, autonomous ideas of new sense making can eventually sort of interact with each other.
Yeah, yeah. It doesn't seem, just from my perspective, it doesn't seem to be, necessarily a problem that, from your perspective, something that you had kind of foreseen is now kind of being played out, at least in terms of, people recognizing the problem, or people recognizing, kind of the direction that we need to go. I mean, I can imagine that it could feel frustrating. It's like, if only people had listened to me or understood what I was saying earlier, then we could have gotten to this earlier. But it also seems to me that it's unclear what influence any of us does have. Like, even if we feel like we're not having much impact on the collective sense making, perhaps we are. Like, perhaps, your ideas did slip out there, in imperfect forms, and, helped to be part of, this kind of collective ecology where these ideas are now becoming more prominent and more mainstream.
Mm-hmm.
I guess maybe that's my way of saying take heart, or, to caution you against being too frustrated with the process. I mean, it might also be that the conditions weren't right? Like you could foresee something coming, but the conditions of, both kind of technologically, technological infrastructure, it just wasn't there, and, to allow for, kind of understanding of the world to correlate with the state of technology, right?
Yeah, I want to inject something real quick, which is that, like, the idea of finding the others inherently creates the other, right? Yeah. So what I say is, like, why am I an individual agent? Why am I an autonomous being who's not, like, trying to create a structure to do it, and I'm just presenting this to the world? Is that it's like my brain doesn't want me to answer this question. It's maybe. Like, it's like telling me, like, you're not allowed to know, because every time I get close to it, it just drops out. What the fuck is that? It's so weird. Maybe the universe doesn't want you to know yet. It's like, no, we're not giving up the goose yet. I'm just gonna take it from you. Where'd the thought go in your head? I'm not telling you, it went away.
Well, okay, so let's focus in a little bit on some of your specific ideas. So let's talk about social proof of work. Mm-hmm. What is your idea behind social proof of work? Does it relate at all to your idea about holding people accountable to their predictions?
Yeah. So, all right. We all have different perspectives. What is the best way to capture those different perspectives? I've made this pretty broad claim that over the years that things like GPT-3 are knowledge representation models, that they store knowledge. Some people disagree with that, but I'm like, if I can read something that is output by it and it gives me knowledge, and that sentence was never said by any human being, but it was said by this model, it has stored some knowledge because of my interaction with it. There is then the question of, what do you store upon that model, and how do you use it best to collect knowledge in a way that becomes increasingly useful and helpful to people, right? So if we just talk about things like predictions, well, that's not really enough. If we're just talking about, who are the best predictors, well, what if somebody just predicts a very unwanted future, right? What if somebody predicts that, we are going to be able, or we're going to end up in plastic boxes. We're going to end up with VR headsets. Or somebody said recently, and they're like, I have a feeling by the end of 2022, I'm going to see somebody with an Oculus Rift, like, on their face in public. Yeah. And like I was saying, well, yeah, I think that's pretty likely too, but I want to express that is an unwanted future, right? So on top of beliefs, there are also actions that we can take to change the world, right? Now, the actions that we take can come in the form of claims, like either I am going to take this action, or this is the action that I took. And then also there are the claims about the actions that come as a result of it. If I recall correctly, I skimmed a little bit of the Regen Network white paper, and they're talking about individual claims about land health and like actual physical monitors of like soil health, and like people making claims and then being held accountable to those claims, whether it actually increases the quality of the soil health by some particular determination of what healthy means. In Futarchy, you have a similar sort of thing where it's like you are making predictions about whether specific variables of collective well-being are moved up or down, right? So social proof of work is that how do you quantify actions into that system? How do you quantify the things that we are taking, or the actions that we are taking to make this better future, and then connect that back to that individual person? It's a thing that is beyond a claim, but it's still a claim that you're going to do it. You might say that like with Jordan Hall's Civium, he had an example if you want to fix like a pothole. And so he would say like there would be a project proposal, and then they would be allocated the tokens or whatever to be able to do that. And it's like, well, you can't have full confidence that they're actually going to pull off, filling the pothole well, and whether the pothole will actually held up over the long-term future, right? The materials that they use could break down, like they could just do a poor job, right? So social proof of work is a play on the idea of proof of work, but bringing it into the social landscape of like, we are making claims about the future that is some representation of truth, or we are making claims about actions that we have taken to be able to improve that future. And so it's more of a human way to describe something that isn't inherent in the algorithmic process of sharing these different beliefs, right? Because you can share all different types of beliefs. So I'm saying, well, on top of the layer that you're sharing your beliefs, bring it into actions about the real world, actions that you're taking to change the real world. And then in the long run, did those actions actually benefit the greatest number of people by their own perception over time, right? Especially when, they claim or they view that, you're sort of wrong. You're a voice that is in opposition to the collective voice. So for example, like one way that I like to think about the idea of social proof work. So you have this sense making network. You can share your claim about anything, or you can share your beliefs about particular actions that could actually, help. And then other people can take actions to actually make those changes. So imagine that there's a society that is troubled by a diminishing population of fish, for example, which is real. Fish supplies are dwindling. You have local ecosystems where those fish are no longer thriving. Of course, there are other pockets on the planet where more fish are actually thriving than ever, just because of the changes to the environment. Maybe the increase of warmth actually makes one particular type of fish in that local area actually thrive. So there's a lot of people in this that would like to see more fish, or would like to see an increase in local fish populations. And they have all of these different beliefs about what the best actions to take. So today there are three people in a society or community that are proposing solutions. One is saying that, well, the problem is that you have all of these big corporations and they are just fishing without, regard for how much they're taking out of the ocean. They even have like food waste. So like a lot of the fish don't actually ever make it to the table. So I think the real problem is that like the individuals don't have the power to be able to get their own fish. And if I was just teach every person to fish and give them all the tools that they needed to fish, everything would be, get better, and there wouldn't be any problems. The second person says, well, here's the thing, there's a limited amount of fish, and there's a limited amount of fish, and if you just put me in charge of the amount of fish, if we just pool all of our fish together that come in our locality, and then I distribute them appropriately to just each person gets a fixed number of fish and nobody can take more than their fair share, then that solves the problem. You need this sort of hierarchical distribution process to prevent people from taking advantage of it. And I think that I'm a good person for that. Another person says, well, fuck that. It's a living, breathing ecology, right? Like, it's not so simple as just this bucket of fish that we get. It's like they are diminishing, not just because of overfishing, because they don't necessarily have this thriving ecosystem to be able to live and have many children and therefore continue to produce as a resource for us. So I think that if I was to go and dump iron filings into the ocean, those iron filings will create an algal bloom. The algal bloom will bring back the sardines. The sardines will bring back a little bit bigger fish. These are all ideas. These are all ideas of work that you can do to benefit other people. It's like to benefit society, right? You have a belief that if you take this, it will benefit a large number of people. And all of these people may be justified in taking these actions, but because it's the commons, it's very difficult to actually just like stop anybody from doing anything. Like, it's hard to stop people from polluting the air because it's just there and we all have to share it. And there's no real way to well regulate something that we consider the commons, like fish populations, but like there it is. So the thing is that what matters is that whatever happens, those different voices are still going to be trying to make sense of the world in the future, trying to take new actions relevant to new problems in the future. So if individual people are taking these actions, and if individual people are just staking their claim that these actions are going to improve society for all, there should be some sort of reward for being right, and there should be some sort of detriment for being incorrect. I don't think that reward should be in the form of money. I think it should be in the form of just attention to their voices and the ideas that they're sharing about how to make the world a better place. Because each one of those people could be right depending on context, right? They could be completely right or they could be completely wrong. There's no one fits all solution. In some villages,
like a controlled experiment with all three in the same place.
Yeah, like it's whatever happens, but they have their perception that it is going to be good. Like there may be a local village where there actually is a very trustworthy person who is just like, bring me the fish, I will distribute it. We will, prevent us from overfishing. We'll keep tallying to know how many fish we're taking out so that in the future, the fish supplies will go up. Maybe they're right, but maybe over time that position of power corrupts them. Maybe they start to give a little bit more to their friends. Maybe they start to give a little bit more to their family. Or maybe with the iron filings, maybe it causes that local, maybe it actually causes an ecological collapse. It didn't do what they expected it to do, and they actually caused a lot more problems. Or maybe with the giving everybody the ability to fish on their own, you get the tragedy of the commons, which is that people think that other people are going to take too much, so they just take more than their fair share. That's not a guaranteed thing. Depending on the locality, depending on the people who are actually living in that community with that particular commons, with that particular resource, it may be that one of them is right and the other is wrong. Or if you go to a different place, maybe a different solution is more successful, right?
Mhm.
So the idea behind social proof of work is quantifying the actions that we are trying to take to improve society, to try to help the most people. And then depending on the outcome, then those voices being amplified or more or less than they were before.
Yeah. Let me throw something at you and see how this fits into this social proof of work idea. So, I'm sure you're familiar with like Eleanor Ostrom and work on the commons and,
What's the first word?
Eleanor Ostrom.
Not familiar.
Okay, well, she's done a lot of work on like successful commons management, where she basically pushed back against the tragedy of the commons idea and said, actually, there's been numerous successfully managed commons in the past. They follow, they all tend to follow a set of principles. There needs to be some kind of boundary, who's in, who's out. There needs to be some kind of like mutual monitoring process and education. There needs to be some kind of democratic component where people have a voice in how the commons are managed. There's 8 altogether. And she's basically said, look, we've seen that a lot of societies that have followed these principles have been successful over long periods of time. So that's something right there. But the other thing I would throw out is, there's this, and this is something that I know Ashley mentions a lot, and it's this idea of measurement, right? It's this idea that, a lot of the really important things about society, can't really be measured very well, or measuring actually kind of changes the nature of the thing itself. One of the kind of ideas or logic, some of the logic behind localism is that you have enough familiarity with the actual people involved that you don't need these kind of formal measuring mechanisms. Of course, that leaves a number of other questions. Again, like how do you say manage at larger scales, like bioregional scale, where there needs to be some kind of coherence across localities for larger ecosystem health. And so I don't think we could ever get away from this tension. I think it is a real tension, perhaps an irresolvable tension, a trade-off, where the more of how much we can measure, what impact, what is the impact you're having, outside of like a local community context, right? It'll always be an imperfect measurement. And so then the question is, well, how much measurement, again, another example is like the regen network stuff and like paying for ecosystem services and things like that. I think this runs into the same challenge and the same tension. Now, I can imagine that, perhaps, one particular resolution, not a perfect one is having a lot of kind of small scale experiments, at kind of local community level, and then, kind of as a proof of concept, right? Even though the context, different situation is different, but you see, somehow, perhaps with a better information ecology, we see which kind of experiments in living and experiments in natural resource management and community development are the most successful, and those spread kind of in a broad scale manner through, those proofs of concepts kind of spread throughout the network and get taken up by others. So it's kind of like the laboratory of democracy idea. So it's not a large scale implementation. Let's hope for the best. If it doesn't work out, then we're all screwed, versus many small scale experiments, and the successful models can transfer. Now, I think that feeds right into what you're working on, in the sense that, how do we actually know what is, which, approaches are working, which are not? In order to know that, we need, a good kind of collective intelligence and information ecology to not, to make sure that people aren't gaming the system or presenting false information, or, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, so, I think my approach in this interview so far has just been to spew a bunch of things to bounce off you and let you talk. So go ahead.
I mean, what you're describing just sounds like my vision of cognicism, to be honest.
Yeah.
And, I'm aware of the fact that the tragedy of the commons does not always hold up, which is why it's one of those examples in there, is that like there are specific circumstances where that literally does not play out, right? And I think that any type of knowledge that we have or we try to enforce upon the world, or anything that we try to claim as facts, is hubris, right? Our understanding, our capacity to model the world is actually not that good. We understand frighteningly little. But I think that there is this idea of the commons, and there is this idea that we want to be able to steward the commons and find ways to take care of the things that don't fall into this really basic idea of ownership and the exchange of ownership. And I think that, like, of course, we're seeing all of these individual communities doing all of this sort of sense making, right? But if you don't capture that voice, you're just helping yourself. Why not do the work, but also help other people by capturing your perception and the outcome? It honestly, just at a very personal level, like I use, without the technology of the machine learning stuff like that, or anything like that, or any tallying system, like I journal actively my perceptions of the truth over time, and it really does a lot for me to see and to minimize the cognitive dissonance that I may have, because in one context I may be thinking one thing, in another context I may be thinking another thing, and I can scroll back through this whole over since 2014, like I've captured all of these thoughts about how these ideas were emerging, and I can scroll back through and see my thought patterns as it is developed, right? You go through one season, you plant one thing and let you have food for that year, but then the land is a little bit different, and that knowledge has been used and has benefited the individual locality. I just want to capture that knowledge in a useful way, and in a way that makes it such that the ideas that are actually helping the most people, that idea of social proof of work, are the ones that are amplified. I want to amplify the ideas that benefit the greatest number of people, that create a greater sense of collective well-being, not necessarily in a utilitarian sort of way, but in a much more nuanced way. You also talked about this idea of like the measures and trying to optimize for a certain thing, which is another thing that I also think is like, this isn't the right approach of saying we have this collective measure of well-being, we're going to optimize for it, right? Or like we have this collective measure of GDP, we're going to optimize for it. That's why I think the solution of being generative models that are distributing attention, it's not like really that you're optimizing for a particular metric other than, is this information in this particular moment useful and helpful?
Beyond, it doesn't have external validity to its own context.
Yeah. And, the awareness that like not all knowledge is relevant to all people in all different contexts. Like, what does the brain do when you're thinking? Like, how does it bring forth the most relevant and useful information? Well, it doesn't always do it very good. My brain is constantly pulling forth the most random of things. And part of it is just because being exposed to this network, I'm getting, exposed to patterns that are pretty unhealthy. There's a sort of repetition of falsity that is reinforcing in each of our individual minds. So yeah, there are, I think just to sum up, is that all of these people are doing all of this already. You're already doing it. You're online all the time, where everybody's sharing all this stuff. I'm just saying, can we take those signals and distribute it in a little bit of a different way, in a way that isn't controlled by any single source? Here are the potential ways that I think that we can distribute attention in a way that wouldn't be centrally controlled, in a way that can be emergent in sort of a network, sort of a fractal organization, where like You don't necessarily have to join some group or club or whatever to do any individual thing, but you can just share your perception and it can flow into a network. And all of these different sub communities doing this type of processing have ways to keep knowledge local if they want, and they don't want to share it outwards. But when they say, okay, we've learned, we together, we feel pretty confident that this is a path, then they can put it forward into this larger network, and there can be sort of these cascading flows of information and updating of prior beliefs relative to the moment and relative to the context of the individuals trying to interact and interface in the world and just trying to make a better world, you know?
Yeah. So we've been going for almost an hour and a half. And so we should probably wrap up pretty soon, but I want to give you the opportunity, if you were interviewing yourself, you know, what prompt would you give, or what would you ask, and then go ahead and answer it? Do you want to do that? Do you have a thing of, you know, what is something that you've wanted somebody to ask you and to talk about for years and they just haven't done it?
I don't know if I should, because it's sort of like a litmus test for whether people are really paying attention.
Yeah.
Maybe I can think of like one I think that is glaringly obvious that I haven't seen people dig into, which is that in the manifesto, I define a protocol for how these different organizations are essentially putting their word out into the world. It's just a structure for like how they're saying, and some sort of it's like a TCP or HTTP, but it's like for claims, right? And I talk a lot about the claims, right? But in forethought, it's like predictions, statements about the present, reflections are perceptions of the past. There's also questions. If you go through the entire manifesto, I never answer how the questions would play into the sense making work, like how it would actually interface and work with the models. And part of that reason was because I think it can work independently without this added extra aspect of being able to query it through questions. Like it can work with just claims, but so therefore it's like, it's not incomplete for me having not mentioned it, but I do believe that it can function a lot better and open up to it a level of explicability, right? If you have these questions, if you have some questioning about how the system is distributing attention, if you want to understand the rationality behind some sort of claim that the system is making, that you can actually do that by asking the questions. And you can also use it in a sense-making way of where, like, okay, I don't have any certainty about this particular claim. Like that's a statement or a prediction or a reflection about the past. A claim is related to some level of certainty. You have some level of certainty about the world. A question is not that. A question is inherently uncertain. It is a querying of information. So that was one of the things that I had wished that people had, asked me, like just dug enough to understand, to see it as a gap and be like, why haven't you mentioned this? I'm like, well, very good. That's a very good question. There are answers to that, but it was just to see if people are really paying attention. And there are actually a number of questions within the manifesto that I was like, leave it unanswered, because, like I'm operating on these ideas that, building a system, like there's so many second order effects. There's so many unexpected effects that you could have. Like there's a massive hubris to being able to say, like, I'm going to develop any system, right?
So let me ask you this: when you say building a system, are you saying specifically like building, say, this kind of interactive language model that people can interact with to assess kind of the potential accuracy of claims? Like, what do you mean by you're building a system? What does that mean?
Actually building it out and putting it into the world, like that act of somebody decided that Bitcoin was a good idea, right? And they felt justified in putting out this white paper and putting it out into the world. Now, there have been a lot of unexpected, effects from that. Like they couldn't possibly predict like exactly how the things would play out. And the same thing with Ethereum, which is like Ethereum has really high gas fees right now because of the number of people interacting with the network. And so there's like, you have all of these systems out there right now, these crypto-based systems that are having unexpected effects and aren't necessarily positive effects, right? So I envision that more and more people are going to start putting systems in the world, meaning they're going to build a white paper. Regen Network is an example of one, like implementations of futarchy. Like lots of people are going to put these in the world based off of this certainty in their gut that this is a good thing to do, right? I have a certain level of confidence that building out a system like this and putting it into the world will actually dramatically make the world a better place. But if I was to sit here and think about my context of how many people have actually understood what I'm saying in this moment, if I was to put it out into the world, whether it would actually turn out well or whether it would have negative effects, I think it might actually have negative effects right now. But if I was to wait until more people are independently coming to these conclusions about like how we are expressing our truths online, then maybe the actual implementation of it will turn out well. Because once you let the cat out of the bag, once the Bitcoin is out in the world, once the chain is out into the world, or whatever system that you have is out there, and it becomes this meme that is beyond your own self, you no longer control it. That's creating a meme that is beyond yourself, creating an ism, creating communism, creating capitalism, It's like you no longer control it, and it can no longer represent the initial intent necessarily, unless it was, it's really going to go into this emergent place, right? Where you cannot necessarily predict all the actions. And even now people say like communism, real communism has never really been tried. Well, what does that mean? What is the actual circumstances under which that you would say that it has been tried and therefore proven to be functional or not functional, right? And the same thing happens with like capitalism, which is that we have all of these very, 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 very different perspectives of what it actually means, right? So it's like it would be the idea of letting a cat out of the bag. What is going to happen? And I'm talking about a system that is trying to evaluate the future and whether things are actually good on this presumption that the idea in its first right is like good. So therefore, like I feel like the only way to be logically consistent is to just say, okay, continue to communicate. And if other people come to these conclusions, which it seems like they increasingly are, then you're going to have all of these minds in a decentralized place who are all trying to build towards this new thing. And it probably will not be named cognicism. It'll probably be that you have many different implementations that are kind of similar, each with their own names from their own like developers. And hopefully what I view is being like, it's like this mycelial network of these little branches growing together. And provided that there is some sort of protocol, which I think that the sort of forethought protocol of how people are sharing these perceptions is actually very, very solid, and probably is one of those things that can just remain. It's not like an institution. It's just like, it is a protocol for exchanging our perceptions of what is and what isn't true. Then we can have a truly decentralized new system of sense making and decision making that will not have the second order effects that we'd expect. And that like essentially I can put into this world, like anybody who is putting into this world a system where like people are unable to express the mere notion that their idea is going to fail, that's not a good system. Like it has to be self-terminating in some regard if it is not turning out well. Like it has to be that if somebody's saying early on this prediction that just the fanboyism of like, I think this is the best thing in the world, it just because there are more people on that network, who believe that does not drown out that singular voice, right? So yeah, it's I think there's a logical consistency that I have to being like, okay, they're good ideas, but society has existed for a long time. It's not going to destroy the world for me waiting a day or a year or a few years. In fact, it is healthy for me to put into the world and basically challenge people to say, where am I wrong? What are the places where I have been incorrect about this? And hopefully that I will find the gap, if there is one, to my ultimate reasoning behind this. I don't know necessarily that there is some big gap in there, but I try to operate on the assumption that there might be, and that the only way that I will find the error in my thinking is by exposing it to other people. But if I set out to build it right now, that error in my cognition is baked into the system from the get-go, and it can have a very negative effect.
It's interesting. So to wrap up, what is your appeal to the audience? Do you want people to kind of connect to do you want people to read your white paper? Do you want people to connect to YouTube? Do you want people to reach out to you, to your, DM you and Twitter? For someone listening to this and is interested in what you have to say, what is your appeal to them? You want to just have a conversation? Like, I
would love for people to, check out the formalization of my ideas in the form of videos or in the Cognicist Manifesto, but knowing that, language is fuzzy and whatever is in my mind is not going to perfectly transmit into your mind. So I think I posted a video recently, like the best thing that you could do is like learn to better be able to communicate your perception of truth over time, and also be willing to reflect back upon your claims in the past. Like start to create some sort of second brain. Like that is far more important than you just like listening to what the fuck I am saying, because in the process of sharing your own perceptions or tracking them and then like reflecting them upon them in the future, you're going to find your own errors of cognition. You're going to move towards a better understanding of the world on your own. Yes, I have suggesting different ways to do that, but you can look up things like PKM, personal knowledge management, or like the idea of a second brain that is independent from many of these ideas. But unless we embrace with this idea of like, I am exploring and troubling my perceptions of the future over time, and I'm willing to look back upon my inconsistencies and be able to update my own beliefs. I can't force into another person's mind what I'm saying, but there is something that I'm generating. So call to action, sure. Go to Speaker John Ash YouTube, go to the Cognicism.org and read sort of what I'm putting out there. I think it holds up for a lot of different minds, but understand that the way that you're perceiving meaning from the language that I'm forming, right, is relative to your own structure, right? So the meaning, the thought that gets created in your own head is only going to be like a subfraction of what I'm intending to put out into the world. So, yeah.
Let me suggest what I think is a complementary suggestion for the audience, and you can tell me if you agree or not. I would say the complementary, you said like build a second brain. I would say that doing that without complementary, being part of an embodied process where you actually get real world feedback. So, I mean, one reason I like homesteading and the idea of homesteading so much is that you are putting your ideas out there in a physical way, and you're getting feedback. Either your crop does well or it doesn't, right? Either your soil is getting ruined or it's not. So you are getting that immediate kind of embodied feedback. And that could apply to many other things. It can be applied to community building. And so I guess one complementary thing I would say is that, my critique of the second brain stuff in the past has been that you're adding kind of these meta layers of disembodied cognition, which, disembodiment already seems to be a problem in
Yeah.
kind of Western society in general. And so I would say yes, and don't do that without implementing some kind of embodied feedback loop in your life that is giving you this kind of situated cognition that is
Yeah.
evolving.
No, I agree. And you know, when I released that video, Speak Your Truth, it's like one of the frames of it is like, it doesn't necessarily have to be this private relational thing, that by taking the time to refine your perception of truth and put it into the world, instead of just reading news, like reading news is just consuming the views of other, take the time to phrase what you think is valuable information to collective society, you know, what you think is socially relevant and will improve people's life. Take the time to learn to phrase it as well as you can, and then actually put it into the world. And don't stop because some people disagree with you or have negative responses to it. You need to have that real embodied feedback loop with the other. But there is also, when you do part of that in private, you begin to see the inconsistencies in your own belief. And that helps you, that when you do feel comfortable enough to put that the sort of ideas or conclusions or frames that you have come to into the world, you feel a little bit more confident that you're not polluting the information ecology, right? We have, you know, already we do a lot of thinking in our brain that is hidden and doesn't get, you know, released out to the world. But, you know, when we frame those or save those beliefs for us to further review, you see yourself through the outside, right? You can see yourself as if it's another person saying these ideas, and then a further layer of putting it out into the world through either like making videos every day or making songs weekly or whatever it is that is your form of communication about this is the truth, or this is like my perception of the world, and this is the actions and ideas that are most useful to make and build a better future.
Nice. That seems like a good place to wrap up. We usually cut off, it's kind of a gimmick on the show that we usually cut off the guest at the end saying something whatever. So feel free to just start saying something, and we're gonna cut you off.
Oh my gosh, should you just scream? Because, you know, then you could have a perfectly scut scream.